Thank you so very much, James. You were spellbinding, as I had expected. I would open the topic now for a general conversation. If you'd allow me, I'll ask a couple of questions straight away. First, in terms of the conventional indicators, like the number of people fighting for ISIS or number of people killed, India, in spite of the vast Islamic population, remains at the far lower end. Now, it doesn't mean Saudis don't pump money into Indian madrasas, but the export somehow doesn't quite catch fire. So what makes India immune to the influence of the Wahhabi export? The second one is a comparative question with a policy dimension. What transforms Frankenstein 1 to Frankenstein 2? Frankenstein 1 is made to do the biddings of the master, and Frankenstein 2 becomes the master. So if export of Wahhabism is the necessary element, what are the other conditions, the sufficient conditions that make it explosive? Could, for example, a variation of that theme would be, could nationalism be promoted as an antidote to Wahhabism?
Well, let me start with the last point, and I think that Madawi would probably answer you that Wahhabism is becoming nationalism.
Okay.
And there are people who will argue that what you're seeing in Baghdad is the rise of Shiite nationalism. So much for that. I think the answer to both of your questions, I think, is more or less the same. And I'm not, I bow to you on India. I don't know India, but I do want to say some more general points. One is that as inward-looking and what have you that Salafism, Wahhabism is, it does not, by definition, lead to militant politics or violence. Yeah. So the fact that you have an enormous campaign and an enormous amount of money being put into it leads to greater conservatism, different other, depending on what country you're talking about, different societal problems, but not necessarily, 1 and 1 is not 2 in this case. And when you look at the background of those that have joined jihadist groups, it really is a mixed bag. The German intelligence agency came out with a report this week in which I think, if I remember the figures correctly, somewhat more than 500 German nationals had joined IS. Of that, a third were converts, and a third came out of conservative Muslim institutions, and a third, I haven't read the report fully, but in any case, you look at the backgrounds of Indonesian fighters, none of them come from conservative backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So what I do think is true is that in a number of Muslim countries, the campaign was one factor, an important factor, but not the only factor in moving societies to become more conservative, more pious. And, it's throughout history, radicals run the train. Once the train leaves the station, you either get on or you get lost. And in a sense, that's what you're seeing. What I was saying about NU in Indonesia, the way it's having to adopt certain concepts. I can't answer you specifically on India.
Okay. Thanks very much. The topic is now open for a general conversation. Please raise your hands, or identify yourself, and ask your question. Yeah.
I'm Madawi al-Rashid, who James referred to, and I'm a professor, visiting professor at the Middle East Institute, just 2 floors down. It's a pleasure to listen to you, James, and thank you for a tour de force. I just have some comments, and perhaps just link it with the first question. I just want to mention that in the 18th century, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, was so influenced by an Indian scholar by the name of Hayat al-Sindi, who was part of Ahl al-Hadith, which is the people of the saying of the Prophet, who was resident in Mecca at the time. So the transnational connections are really deep-rooted in history. But that's the side point. The first point I want to mention is about the confusion between Wahhabi and Salafi. We tend to use the words as if they are the same. And I think Wahhabism was known as Wahhabism in the 18th century, and it only became Salafi at the beginning of the 20th century as a result of the cooperation of Arab religious scholars who came to Saudi Arabia. They started calling it Salafi in order to rehabilitate the Wahhabi movement and make it mainstream Sunni Islam. But the Salafis that the Wahhabis claim that they are is so different from other types of Salafis. One such a group is the 19th century Muhammad Abdu movement in Egypt, which was a modernist reformist Salafi up to a certain extent, which has nothing to do with Wahhabis. So those of us who use Salafi to refer to the Wahhabi are actually legitimating the Wahhabi movement, making it mainstream Sunni Islam. But my points, I have 3 points that I would love to see more research on, and I'm sure in your forthcoming book you would touch on that. Can we really understand the Frankenstein without looking at the accomplice states, whether they are the US, Britain, or Southeast Asian states with the Saudi regime that opened the doors for this kind of transnational religious connections that turned sinister in some locations? To just give you one example, in the 1980s, during the Afghan jihad, Wahhabism wasn't a soft power. It was actually a project sponsored by the United States and the UK, paid for by the Saudis and and enacted in Pakistan by the intelligence services. So basically, can we talk about soft power? This is not soft power as far as I'm concerned. It is a deliberate attempt to instrumentalize the Wahhabi tradition in the service of foreign policy. The other point I want to talk about, if we take it at its face value that this is a kind of soft power the Saudis export, can we understand the receptiveness of societies in Southeast Asia without looking at the conditions that make this kind of soft power receptive, given how different Islam had been in these countries for centuries? So what are the conditions that make an Indonesian, a Malay, a Pakistani, a Bangladeshi, an Indian receptive to Wahhabism? The final point I want to mention, I'm glad you talked about the resilience and how there is a whole industry that specializes in predicting the downfall of the House of Saud. And I'm actually at the moment looking at that as part of my research project at MEI. You've already mentioned the divided society, which I wrote about. But there is something important. Saudis survive also because there is an international will to tolerate Saudi. It's not only about oil. It's not about strategic location. It's about the 8 to 10 million foreign workers who live in Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine if, for example, Saudi Arabia decides to expel 2 million Pakistani workers or 1 million Filipino workers? So these governments have a stake in the stability of this regime. Can you imagine what happened to remittances? The Saudis know that, and they always threaten. They did it once in Yemen in the 1990s when Ali Abdullah Saleh sided with Saddam against the Saudis. They expelled 1 million Yemenis to Yemen, and the union between North and South collapsed, and Yemen went into a serious economic recession and also political turmoil, as you know. So all these Southeast Asian countries seem to me have a stake in the survival of this regime, are willing to keep a blind eye on the abuse that takes place among domestic workers, and it's all documented by international NGOs. So basically, the Saudi regime has created this kind of connections that are human. It's not about exporting ideology. It's about these countries having a stake in the survival of this system. these are just my reflections on your talk, which I really enjoyed, and I think it's just covered so much.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much. You want to respond, Rashid?
Sure. Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, totally agree on the Salafi-Wahhabi equation. Let me say a few things, though, on the other issues, and in many ways they're interlinked. First of all, I think there are two large pictures we got to look at. The first large big picture is that Western policy, U.S. policy, and what you're seeing today is payback time, if you wish, was stability over everything. So the United States, Western nations were willing to support increasingly autocratic regimes at whatever price, because that would maintain stability in the Middle East. So if that involved Wahhabism, so be it. So I don't think it was a deliberate choice, you know, that the Ayatollahs in the White House decided that they liked the Ayatollahs in Riyadh. But it was simply pure opportunism. And it's a policy that's falling apart on multiple levels. You know, it's a product of short-time thinking. I'm fairly sure that if you were to do a cost-benefit analysis, the short-term cost of just telling these guys, you're on your own, call me, would probably be a lot cheaper than the long-term cost of what short-term policies are provoking. So, in that sense, yeah, sure, complicity, absolutely. But not because this was state-sponsored, you know, the United States, the West buying into this and saying this is what we're going to do. I think it was state-sponsored in terms of the Saudi element of it. And again, you know, look at what happened in 2001, 2002 with the whole Herndon conglomerate, which was a conglomerate of basically Wahhabi Saudi-funded organizations, which turned out were also the imams training Muslim clerics in the U.S. military, and so I think that is much more complex. I think the second issue, which you raised, which is, you know, what's the appeal? Frankly, in some ways, first of all, you know, if you're going to put this kind of money into it and offer, certainly in poorer areas of Pakistan and wherever, education, you're going to have an impact. But more importantly, I think, you know, this goes again to a much bigger picture in my mind that goes far beyond the Middle East and far beyond Islam, for that matter, and which is, I would define, you know, the decade that we're living in as a decade of dissent and defiance. You're seeing across the board lack of confidence in systems, lack of confidence in leaders, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about student protests in Santiago de Chile, Occupy Wall Street, the rise of people like Trump and Bernie Sanders, and there's only one ism around. I mean, you go back 40 years, you had communism, nationalism, socialism, Arab nationalism, Arab socialism. There's nothing around. And I think that's, you know, on top of all, and again, you can go into social and economic conditions, and that's part of the explanation. But it's only part of the explanation because some of those guys who radicalize are not in socially or economically dire straits. So I think that that's the larger picture that we're looking at in terms of the appeal. Let me just see if I missed anything here. Yeah, the last thing, the foreign workers. I mean, sure. Several things about it. One, I think it's part of the stability argument, on the one hand, certainly in terms of Western societies. But, you know, frankly, that was true for the Soviet Union, and it's true for China. I mean, they're in many ways equally guilty. They all bought over the last decades into autocratic regimes in the region. I think what happens with the primarily today Asian nations that are supplying labor to the Gulf is basically it's an economic thing. It takes people off the labor market that they can't. All of these issues in my mind, and I've written about this extensively, are coming together in the Qatar World Cup. Football's always comes back. You know, this is, I mean, I actually think, and I just very briefly to explain why, that, you know, most mega sporting events produce two things: massive debt and white elephants. And whatever the international sporting community wants to say about change and progress and all of this, it's baloney. Potentially, Qatar may be one of the exceptions. It's too early to say. And that would have a major impact. And what Qatar already has done, it's not only put Qatar on the spot, it's put the labor supplying countries on the spot, who've been complicit in what are abominable working conditions. I hope that answers it.
Thank you. Vous voulez la parole? Okay.
Thank you, James, for this very fascinating presentation. I agree with most of your points, as I did with Madawi's points. Actually, I have 2 or 3 brief comments. The first one is about the debate, Salafism, Wahhabism debate. I think there are 2 things. The first of all, let's say it's more or less pure religious stuff, in the sense that what Salafism is or should be in the eye of the one who has interest, in presenting him or herself, as a Salafi, as a Wahhabi, especially because there is a crisis of identity today throughout, let's say, the Islamic arena, of course. But there is also a second thing, which is that in terms of political identity, you mentioned, for example, yesterday, the fact that Aid al-Qarni was shot, in the Philippines. So Aid al-Qarni is supposed to be a Sunni, Salafi, Wahhabi cleric, to put it short. But who said, or who knows, some people here I think they know, and he's actually an opponent to the regime. He's a Sahwi. So it means that by being, Salafi, Wahhabi, Sunni, extremist, more or less extremist, cleric, but he's also, someone, opposing to the regime, and he's extremely critical, against the regime. So what, at the end of the day, Wahhabism is in terms of political identity and political militancy? That's my first question. And
sorry, what is?
What Wahhabism is, should be in terms of political militancy. I'm not talking about the religious debate, So Aid al-Qarni is a very good example. And today, if he's, let's say, I think he's more or less safe now, but he's not going to be killed. He's not going to die. But assuming, he died, he passed away, Saudi Arabia would have used him, as, I would say, a martyr, someone, representing, the core, the very soul of Saudi Arabia as a Wahhabi, Salafi, Sunni regime, wanting to struggle, let's say, deviant and a renegade regime, which is Iran today. So that's the first point. The second point is about, the role of Salafism, Wahhabism as potentially, as possibly creating violence, and reinforcing, sectarian divides in the Middle East. I would say yes, but also to some extent. In the sense that it is a cause, probably, no doubt about that, but it's also a consequence. It's because, we need to replace this kind of debate, in a broader context. Because, for example, today, if you look at Syria, I'm not sure that, of course, let's say, very radical extremist discourse has, for sure, a role, a big place, a big role in the fact that some young people from Indonesia, from France, from Germany, as you mentioned, go there, to define the oppressed Sunni population, because in Iraq you had, the impact of the Maliki regime, Maliki government, and in Syria, of course, we all know about the Assad regime. But I would say it's also another example of the fact that it's not so religious as it's political, because I mean, for example, if you look at the US, if you look at the Jewish world and so on, you have people, you have actors and entrepreneurs saying, that you have Jews against non-Jews, you have Christians and so on, but it doesn't create, military divides. You have the Amish, for example, in the Utah, in the US, they are probably, sorry? Sorry, but in Pennsylvania. So, but their discourse is extremely, I would say, dividing, but do not go to war and they do not go and create violence, because it's a matter of imaginary, political imaginary, which is already existing before, let's say, some religious entrepreneurs come into the ground and say it has to do about religion, it has to do about Islam, and so on. And the third, my final comment will be about Saudi Arabia in itself, that how difficult it has become, to deal with this country. It's because in terms of sociology of international relations, we need to define who is your friend, who is your partner on the first hand, but also who is your enemy. So it has to do with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and even Russia to some extent. Who is your partner? Who do you need to side with? For example, if you want to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, if you want to deal with Iraq, with Syria, and so on. And that is one of the strengths of Saudi Arabia, actually, because it's both. Because, see, no one today is able to say that, okay, we need to deal with the Saudi problematic, of course, but we need Saudi Arabia to solve the problems on the ground. And it's also a threat, actually. It's an asset. It's a Saudi asset, actually, because they are able to say, okay, you don't like us. I think we don't like you neither, actually, in terms of values, as you said. But okay, who is better positioned if you want to solve, let's say, some issues on the ground? So that is one of the very, very specificities in the Middle East, which is that the divide between friends and enemies, it's not so relevant. I mean, it's the same for Turkey, it's the same for Iran, but Saudi Arabia is probably one of the most perfect examples of that. Thank you very much.
Do you want to react right away?
Yeah, let me react. First of all, look, Salafism is an umbrella term. Salafism is an umbrella term. They come in all stripes. I don't think that the Saudi motivation in funding a lot of this is political identity. It's creating soft power, i.e., a degree of empathy or whatever among major Muslim communities, and essentially, countering Iran before it does that. That's what that was about. It wasn't a question of identity. On the issue of the prejudices and whatever that are involved in Salafism, sure. Look, we all have prejudices, if we're honest with ourselves. And some of those are racist or discriminatory or whatever. Fact of the matter is, though, and we can manage those. But fact of the matter is that you do have ultra-religious groups, which include the Salafis on the Muslim side, but they include, you have a community in London who last year, a Jewish community, where the Jewish school last year decided that children would be expelled from the school if it was women bringing their children in cars to the school. And the authorities stepped in, and they basically gave, you know that, probably. Yeah, they gave the school a choice. You either get shut down or you withdraw this, and the school withdraw it.
Okay.
You have no, let me just, give me just 1 second. You have a Salafi sheikh, very prominent in the Netherlands. So recently, he's at a gas station, and this being the Netherlands, it's self-service. So there's an infidel woman who doesn't know how to fill her gas tank. So the sheikh gets out of the car, and he helps her. And then he walks back to the car, and his little 4-year-old says, "Why are you helping an infidel?" And that's exactly why he did it. And I think that's where the difference lies. You've got an educational system that that educates to live your life and your relationships with others in that way. Now, on the third point, I'm not sure that I got you on that, but if I did get you on it, it's assuming, it's based on the assumption of this is what it is. First of all, you go back 40 years, 50, actually 40 years, less than 40 years. The primary non-Israeli ally in the Middle East was Iran. Iran's ability at the time, under the Shah, to buy weapons in the United States was unrestricted. Not even the Israelis had that at that time. You know, they were flying F-14s long before the Israelis ever had them. So, first of all, nothing's permanent. I think there are two issues. One is the issue that I raised earlier, which is a fundamental question of, you know, whether support for these regimes is ultimately going to produce what the United States and others want, or if ultimately the price is going to be one that's very heavy, as we're starting to find out. What I'm arguing is, and I don't know what the answer to that is, what I'm arguing is that the contradictions involved in that are becoming sharper. And therefore, and that's influencing the way people are thinking. I mean, you're getting the kind of debates in Saudi Arabia that you would have not had 5 years ago. And coming out of intelligence circles, policymakers, and so on, statements that would have been unthinkable about.
Thanks very much. I have two names on my list at the moment, Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhary and Mr. Jumabhai. I'll take the questions in that order.
Thanks. But I'm not going into the sort of excellent Jim and enjoyed it as much as I'm always on to do. I'm not going into the theological debates between Salafism, Wahhabism, if such a thing as Wahhabism exists, by the way, because the Saudis will, or Salman will tell you that
Sure.
it doesn't exist in Saudi Arabia. That's another important point. It's how you define.
No,
and
they just
describe
define it. No, they just label it differently.
Yeah, but I'm a policy maker, or was a policy maker in any case. So this thing is intensely realpolitik. Of course, Madam, as you say, and it's very true that we need Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar to be stable, because we have 1.8 million in Saudi Arabia, we have 1 million in the UAE, and we have 0.5 million in Qatar. And we want nothing to stand in the way of the stability of at least these three countries. Interestingly, the closest religious cognate, you mentioned India, in the Indian subcontinent to this entire debate between the moderates and the extremists is the Deobandi and the Barelvi school. And the Barelvis will call the Deobandis the local Indian Salafis or Indian Wahhabis. But I'm talking politically because I had been a diplomat, as you are aware. Our resonance with Saudi Arabia is for another reason, which is because as a reaction to Nasserite pan-Arabism, Saudi Arabia was also behind the creation of this organization called the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, as they call it now. It is the Organization of Islamic Conference earlier, which sort of mainstreamed the peripheral Muslim countries like ours, you see, which did not form a part of the Nasserite pan-Arabism. So when the Saudi response to the Nasserite pan-Arabist was the OIC, there was Pakistan and Bangladesh and India and that kind of thing resonating to Saudi Arabia. That I thought was a great diplomatic masterstroke, even before the petrodollar and even before this thing, that the creation of the OIC as a counter to pan-Arabism. Thank you. I mean,
No, I totally agree with you. Absolutely.
and this was something that was not always. It's not always.
No. It's a very valid point, and I'm glad you raised it. Absolutely.
Okay. Jumabhai?
Mine's rather a confused question.
We're all confused.
I'm intellectual. It starts me with the people who call themselves Muslims. They have a whole it's called the Quran. And the Quran, the Quran says, La ikra fi din.
You have your religion, and I have mine. Lakum deenukum waliya deen. You have your religion, and you have mine. Now, whether Muslims follow it or not is another matter. Mostly they don't. In all these cases, they're not following the Quran. They're not following the Prophet either. That's just to clear things. Same thing in Hinduism. There is the Gita. There's a beautiful paragraph which I had quoted, as I annually do, on Gandhi's UN Day of Nonviolence. I gave a speech. On this, I have quoted also the Gita, which again says something about a supreme God. This I learned from a Muslim scholar, all right? So that's as far as that is concerned. Now, as far as Lawrence of Arabia and the creation of the Saudi state came under the British Empire and it passed on to the American Empire, as in Iran, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company then passed on to the Americans. Again, I think it was the oil that drew American policy if the Saudis would sell the oil in US dollars. That was a very, very important point for both of them. And that's a fact, so it doesn't need any explanation. Now, the third one that I want to ask you about is the effect of Wahhabism. You know, in our neighboring country just now, in Malaysia, we have a huge controversy going on about one MDB and the money that the Saudis are presumed to have paid into the account of the Prime Minister. Today's paper gives more effect about the counter of this. Now, this is a question, because I remember suddenly last year or year before last, the Malaysian government, the Islamic Authority, banned Shiaism in Malaysia. It was not there before. Whether this was a result of some of that money finding its way through, I don't know. But that's a question I want to ask. And the final thing is, I must thank you. I've been following your writings quite carefully every time you send an article where sport interferes in the Arab world, particularly football. I'm very glad those two Arab princes have been voted out. So at least we'll have clear.
Well, one of them would not have been bad.
Clean football for a change.
One of them would not have been bad, but that's a different story.
One other thing that I might like to talk to you when I was much younger, Saudi influence, was they were giving the mosques in Singapore free, beautiful carpets, and with their coat of arms, where people put their Muslims, when they bow in prayer, put their heads in. And there was, even in my time, that stage, a lot of complaints. And of course, we threw all those carpets out in Singapore. That's the advantage of having a secular religion. India has an excuse as a secular constitution. So these things are important. But the Malaysian one, really, do you think there's some connection between this gift that was given to the Prime Minister's account and this one MPDA, whatever it's called, that happened? And again, thank you very much for what you...
No,
Before you respond, let me see. Since I don't see any other hands up, that was the last formal question. I'll now... Peter, did you want to intervene? Hang on. Will you give the microphone? Okay. Professor Slaglet.
Well, thank you very much, James. Lucid and comprehensive and comprehensible as always. The only thing that the strand that got a little bit lost, I thought, was the Muslim Brethren, because clearly, in some important way, the Muslim Brethren are the competition, which is why, first of all, helped to topple the Muslim Brethren regime, however incompetent the regime in Egypt, and reinforces the sort of banning of the Muslim Brethren by the Saudis and so forth. So obviously there is some, and I don't expect you to go into it, but there is some complex story in there somewhere. And I mean, obviously the relationship between the worry about, let's say it's Qutb and other sort of prominent Egyptian writers and so forth. And it's quite interesting because in the 70s and 80s you find these Muslim Egyptian and Syrian clerics finding refuge in Saudi Arabia, being encouraged with Saudi support and Saudi money to counter the Syrian and Egyptian regime. So again, there is a complex story there. The other thing a couple of other things. I mean, I'm not quite sure, to put it very crudely, what use the Saudis are to the West anymore. I mean, I think the Saudis. I mean, obviously the oil is important as well, because all this talk about shale. It's going to be a very long time before the United States is really going to be self-sufficient in oil. But I mean, the predictions are vary. And also, I don't know how it would be possible for the Saudi regime to, let's say, jettison Wahhabism or distance itself from Wahhabism, because after all, this is the basis of its legitimacy. And I mean, obviously, totalitarian regimes can change tack, but I mean, essentially, the Chinese abandoning communism and so forth, and pretending that they aren't. But I mean, I think it's difficult. It's difficult for the Saudis because the ideology is so much bound up with where they are and who they are and so on. These are very random thoughts.
Okay, now you have the last word.
Let me, okay, briefly, thank you very much. You've been very gracious. In terms of the Quran, I apologize if I sound like I already. I probably am. But the fact of the matter is, you can take any holy book you want and read into it what you want. It's multiple interpreted. So, sure, what you quote is absolutely accurate. And I would agree with, but nonetheless, there are ways of interpreting it. What, in terms of the oil being priced in dollars, 45 whenever it was when Roosevelt met Abdulaziz. By that time, Bretton Woods had been put in place. The dollar was the gold standard. That was what you were going to price it in. In terms of OMDB, there's been doubt from the moment that the suggestion was that the Saudis had been the source of the monies. In fact, if you look at yesterday's extensive reporting in the Wall Street Journal, where the way these funds have been tracked, it's Abu Dhabi that played a much bigger role. And it's been long. I mean, I've been involved in an investigation in this that was being conducted. And the link to Abu Dhabi was always there. The link to Saudi Arabia was not. In terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, Absolutely. And it's a very complex relationship, and we could probably spend a few hours on it. I want to say a couple of things about it, but these are not full answers to your comment, which is valid. I'm not sure how to describe the relationship, whether it's a love-hate relationship, but it's a very complex relationship. What I do think you got was a fusion, that took place within various groups. I mean, the Sahwa that Muhammad Ali mentioned is a product of that. The Saudis turning on the Brotherhood is a much more complex issue, and not simply the Saudis turning on the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's changing in various ways. I mean, it's not going back to the status anti-quo, but it is changing. But it also had a lot to do with the health of Abdullah at the end, the role of Mohammed bin Zayed, the power struggle that took place as Abdullah was dying. So yes, it's a much more complex thing. In terms of use of the Saudis, look, it depends what your policy goal is. If your policy is maintain stability, no matter what, the Saudis are your address today. A risky address, without question. But who else? Who else is there in the region? There's nobody. Now, that's going to change. That's part of my argument. I think Saudi Arabia, long-term, is a second fiddle state in the region, whether they like it or not. But at the moment, if that is your policy, they're very useful. You can question the policy. Maybe I sort of tried to say this, but maybe I didn't say it very clearly. You're absolutely right. I mean, what legitimacy do the Al Sauds have if they jettison Wahhabism? I think that's why I called it a catch-22. I think that they're caught between a rock, or increasingly being caught between a rock and a hard place. This is becoming increasingly a liability, but it's not one that they necessarily can discharge. And I also think that, theoretically you could argue, well, so what you're going to get is an established ulama that bends over backwards further. It's already bent over backwards quite a bit. But that's going to spark more militant movements. So, yes, you're right, and I don't think that anybody has the answer to it.
Oh, I'm sorry. May I?
Yeah,
very
please.
sorry. But there's one document that I had to ask you for. You know about the Amman Accord 2006-2007 by Jordan, where Saudi Arabia king signed, and the Wahhabi head priest signed, every Muslim state signed, and they all agreed that all the 10 divisions of Islam are Muslim. The 4 Sunni divisions, the 3 Shia divisions, Salafism is mentioned there, the whole book is mentioned there. Every one of this has been disclaimed and broken. These sacred promises of kings, including the Malaysian Prime Minister, Badawi, who signed it, and his number 2, who's a gay. I forgot to mention.
Aren't agreements there to be broken?
Okay, I'm now going to bring the formal part of our conversation to an end. Think tanks do not like conversations to end with a conundrum. As much as I have enjoyed the conversation today, I think we ought to have more conversations because you have left us with a catch-22 situation. What I was hoping would emerge from this conversation is a kind of insight paper which I would have happily considered for publication under the title Taming Frankenstein. And you can keep the subtitle. But obviously, we are not there yet. But you have got us going and thinking. And I would like to thank you very much. ISIS has a policy of never allowing speakers to go away empty-handed. So I thought the latest publication of ISA's Media at Work in China and India would appeal to your taste for journalism.
Thank you very much.
I thank you very much and would invite the audience to join me in thanking you properly. That said, I would like to thank our colleagues from the Middle East Institute very much. This has been one of my hopes in coming to Singapore, to pull together all the talent that are trapped into the various think tanks and work at problems together. Now, Islam in South Asia is one of the main salient themes for the ISAs. With Riaz Hassan, we have already had a workshop. We are going to have more. And I'm going to to Lahore, along with Ambassador Chaudhary and a few other colleagues, to meet up with Javed Burki to sign an MOU with the Burki Institute and work at these issues in terms of policy analysis. And conversations like this, hopefully in collaboration with other think tanks, would certainly help us maximize scarce resources. I would like to thank the audience for your vigorous attention and participation. And this is very, very important for a think tank, because look, think tanks addicted to policy analysis sometimes ignore the fact that beyond policy are issues that need to be resolved so that a framework can be set up for policy analysis. You can't solve problems by throwing money at them. And this is how the quotation from Yubnil goes. Keep your wife under watch, but who will watch the watchers? The pun is, if good God doesn't keep us all under observation, we are lost. Or in other words, post-Hobbesian political science has no answer at all to the concept of the sacred, because at the heart of rationality are issues where you will not be touched without your own permission. That's the whole idea of the sacred. And if the sacred cannot be mapped into political science or policy analysis, then it will not be, at the end of the day, very effective. I mean, can any state have more policemen than men? And if it did, who will police the police? So we are back into the issues that our colleagues from the Middle East Institute were raising, and these issues now form part of the agenda of ISAS. We would be also looking towards multiculturalism as one of our future projects. So you have engaged us in a conversation, I hope, which will go on, and I thank you all for your attention and for your participation.